Hi guys, it's Lauren Mendez, and I'm going to talk a bit about teenage pregnancy and legislation and policies. Now, when we think of teenage pregnancies in a historical, legislative type way, we can all kind of remember that it was only a few hundred years ago that teens were having babies, and it was perfectly normal in society for a woman to have a baby at 15 or 16. But in the last 100 years or so, we've had a shift from teens being expected to have babies to waiting until at least the age of 18 or until they have some sort of other adult status. So, when did teenage pregnancy make its way into legislation and those kinds of conversations of social health? Well, we see that in the 1950s that the issue is pointed out a little bit more specifically and at least started being talked about. But it wasn't really until the 1990s that anything was being begun as far as policy and legislation. I did find some research that Bill Clinton was the first president to address the idea of teen pregnancy in his State of the Union address, thus kind of marking a moment where teen pregnancy became a bit more of a spotlight issue. And so I'll be focusing on legislation and policies from the last 10 years as opposed to through the last 50 years because there really isn't that much to go through. So one policy that I did find was that in 2010, the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Program, or the TPP, was initiated by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, so the USHHS. The goal of the TPP is to use evidence-based programs that reduce the rates of teenage pregnancies. And what makes the TPP very unique is that it uses a multidimensional approach. So it realizes that preventing teenage pregnancy doesn't just come from an abstinence campaign, and it doesn't just come from a birth control campaign, but rather they use techniques like providing sexual education, education on how pregnancy happens in the first place, on abstinence as well, and on birth control and risk factors for teenage pregnancy. So the hopes for this program are that by using these multiple approaches that we'll be able to tackle the issue of teenage pregnancy and reduce it. And there has been a reduction up until 2015 in teenage pregnancy. So that is a promising piece of that legislation. And additionally, when the Affordable Care Act was initiated, I pulled this quote from the USHHS website that it said that the Affordable Care Act law expands health insurance coverage for teens and offers new support for preventative services, innovative models of care, and clinical training, all of which have implications for teenage pregnancy in the United States. So essentially, we're getting some better health care for teens who are pregnant. So some specific legislation, I'm going to read one bill that has been passed and one bill that has been introduced. So one of the pieces of legislation that has been passed for teenage pregnancy is that in 2011, we have the Communities of Color Teenage Pregnancy Prevention Act, which allotted money and resources to reach communities with minorities and populations that were high in immigration status in order to spread awareness of teen pregnancy and how to prevent teenage pregnancy. And that was introduced by the Senate in the 112th Congress. So an example of a bill that's been introduced, and there's hundreds of bills that have been introduced for teen pregnancy but never have been passed. So this is an example of one, and it was just from last year in 2019. And this has been introduced by the House of Representatives, and it's called the Child Interstate Abortion Notification Act. And essentially this law would be that teenagers or people assisting teenagers would not be allowed to cross state lines when seeking an abortion for a teenager. It would make it illegal, and that the teen would have to get the abortion by the laws that they have in their home state. Like I said, this one hasn't been passed, but it's been essentially introduced because the laws on abortion vary from state to state. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the controversial topics section coming up in just a little bit.